Hello everybody, Triarius Wargaming here, and today we're going to talk about one of the biggest historical misconceptions that I see all the time. It's hugely widespread everywhere, and that is that Roman cavalry was bad, that it sucked so bad, the Romans replaced it as soon as they could with cavalry from other nations. So I'm here to kind of talk to you today about how that is, kind of totally wrong. The native Roman cavalry did disappear over time, but it was not due to them being quote unquote bad. So, where am I getting my information from? So, my main source is the book The Cavalry of the Roman Republic by Dr. Jeremiah B. McCall. Now, this book is actually an adaptation of his PhD thesis in ancient history, specifically studying the cavalry of the Roman Republic. And his book, as his work, his studies, as he acknowledges in the book, is the first real study of the Roman cavalry that there is. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit in this video, and I'm talking about this myth. So I'd mentioned how the Roman cavalry, exists. Native Roman cavalry exists, and then at some point it's replaced by men cavalry drawn from other nations, and then you have the auxiliary cavalry later. So the period we're kind of focusing on in this video is the period of the Roman Republic. Now, you can divide up Roman history into a bunch of different periods, which you may or may not be familiar with. But you have kind of the regal period, which is kind of semi mythical in a way. I mean, it did historically exist, but we don't know much about it, and much of the information we have about it is kind of you know of dubious quality, shall we say. So that is kind of, if you take that, kind of exists until around like 509, I think, is when the Republic is established. And then you have the early Republic, which is also, you know, I mean, we can't really say anything for certain. Then we get into the Mid Republic, which is, a much more historically, we have a lot of quality sources for or we don't have a ton, but we have good sources, some archaeological material too for the Mid Republic, and we have archaeology for all of it, but the Mid Republic is where we start to have really solid information, and this is the period of the Punic Wars, of the wars against the successor states. The Mid Republic is when Rome really becomes a power in the Mediterranean. Then you kind of transition into the late Republic, and you'll hear about this all the time, and I think Rome Total War has a big role to play in this. People are obsessed with the Marian reforms, and there's kind of this saying, as Rome transitions from the Mid Republic to the Late Republic, you have these Marian reforms by Gaius Marius. The legionaries become the Marius's mules and all that. You transition from a levy army into a professional army. That's what people say, especially online. That's not exactly the case. There is a real transition period, and really what people talk about as the Marian reforms, they take place over a long time, in my opinion. Historians have different opinions, but from my personal studies and research, I think it, took place over a longer period of time, and there are a lot of characteristics of this levy army that continue throughout the Marian reforms, and we're talking about 100 BC for those. Then you have all those civil wars, Pompey, Sulla, Caesar, all of them, and then you have Augustus, who creates the empire, kind of ends the republic, and it's in that Marian reform time period when the native cavalry disappear around 100 BC. So this idea that the ancient Roman Republican cavalry kind of sucked, this myth stems from a couple places. So first you have this idea that, especially looking at these Marian reforms when Gaius Marius reforms the army, and look, some level of reform did happen, just not really to the extent that, is often kind of talked about in some popular sources, but you have these cavalry, they exist before his reforms, and then they don't really seem to appear much afterwards. And the thinking is kind of, he, cut down the army. He didn't cut it down, but he, improved the army. And if he was improving the army and the cavalry aren't in the army after he's done improving it, then he was cutting, he was trimming the fat, so to speak. He was getting rid of the component that sucked. You also have this kind of look at some specific Roman battles where, the Roman cavalry was defeated, and, drawing the conclusion that this means that the Roman cavalry sucked, period. And I'm going to talk about that more later. The classic idea of the Romans at war in the Republic is, look, the legionaries are super tough. They're this frontal, sledgehammer blow. You're never going to break the center of a Republican Roman army, but the flanks are where they're weak. If you can get around the flanks and surround them, which means defeating the Roman cavalry, you've won the battle. So this reputation for the Roman cavalry sucking really stems from the Second Punic War against Hannibal. And in a number of battles against Hannibal, the Roman cavalry comes off, on the worst end of things. They are defeated. If you look at the initial skirmishes at the river Ticinus, it's a cavalry battle. The Roman cavalry are defeated by the Carthaginian cavalry. Okay, the Roman cavalry sucks. Then you look again at, the Battle of Cannae. The Roman cavalry is crushed by the Carthaginian cavalry. The army is surrounded. The Romans all die. The worst, loss in Roman history, all thanks to those, Roman cavalry who suck, who, let the side down and died on the flanks. And, kind of taking an uncritical look, you had a lot of historians kind of just write off the Roman cavalry. It's like, look, they suffered these defeats in battle, but, so they must suck, basically. But there was not really an in-depth look at the Roman cavalry as a whole. Jeremiah McCall steps in, and he is like, part of the academic environment, part of being a historian is, you're kind of actually examining things that we take for granted. Common knowledge, common sense. Common sense says the Roman cavalry sucks. Well, honestly, I don't think such a thing as common sense exists. But, the job of academics and historians is to challenge conceptions and see, what we really understand about the past. So, when McCall is doing his research, he's kind of saying, well, everyone says the Roman cavalry sucks, but no one's actually done a thorough investigation to, see what their record is actually like. So, in his studies, what he found is, actually quite the opposite. The Roman cavalry, the Punic Wars is kind of the exception. The Second Punic War specifically, that's the exception to, the Roman cavalry's performance. Actually, throughout most of, the Republic's wars, the cavalry performed admirably. So I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the cavalry. The cavalry were drawn from the aristocrats, from kind of the wealthiest class of, not quite the wealthiest, but one of the wealthiest people in Rome were these equites. And when you're examining the Roman army, especially the Republican Roman army in its different forms, you cannot leave out the social component to the structure of the army. And I'd highly recommend picking up Ted Linden's book, Soldiers and Ghosts, which really, it's an awesome book on so many levels, but he examines, the culture and society of Rome and how that impacted its military forces. Because, whether you like it or not, your society's culture heavily dictates, how you fight. And that's still true in the modern age. I would think of, compare Imperial Japan's battle tactics to the tactics of the Allied forces they were fighting. The Imperial Japanese culture promoted a certain kind of warfare that, the Western Allies didn't fight. And if you're familiar with World War II, you'll know what I'm talking about. look at the surrender rates, the casualty rates again for the Imperial Japanese versus the Allies. It's something like 1 in 200, Japanese surrendered compared to being killed. So for every like something like for every 200 Japanese that died, only one surrendered. Whereas you look at the Allies, I think it's something like for every one killed, two surrendered, something like that. Those numbers aren't those numbers are roughly accurate. They might be slightly off, but that is an enormous difference. The culture of Japan versus the culture of the Allies. Surrender is treated totally different. When the Allies arrive at certain islands, the Japanese are really committing mass suicide rather than be captured. So you can see culture has a heavy influence on warfare even in modern day. I would think look at modern warfare also. If you're a member of one of the Western nation militaries, preserving human life is, a big factor in, our armies. We don't want to sacrifice our soldiers needlessly in combat. That's why we rely on air superiority, on artillery, and we try and, use those assets instead of, throwing men into the fight. you know, Whereas, other forces, I'm thinking about maybe like suicide bombing tactics. Like U.S. soldiers, that's not part of our doctrine because it's culturally abhorrent to us. So, our culture dictates the way we fight to a certain extent, to a major extent, actually. Um, so, what I'm getting at here is we can't separate these two things because, your civilization's culture will dictate the manner in which you fight. So kind of some things, you hear people say it's like, well, you got these rich kids, playing at war as the Roman cavalry, and they kind of suck. So even though they're wealthy, you got to think though too. You got to look at the Roman culture, and the Roman culture at this time, heavily emphasized martial qualities. And medieval knights, they were rich kids too. But the thing about being a rich kid, that doesn't mean you're not tough. It means that, you've got trainers training you all day, to fight because that is, part of your culture. And it's part of the Roman aristocrats' culture of this time too. You're training all the time. You have the campus marches in Rome where it was actually, you'd go out and train. And it was kind of, you'd put on a display to train in public in the arts of war. You have the time to learn how to ride a horse. You would have your father teach you how to fight. You would have perhaps like a hired trainer to train you how to fight. These were skilled warriors. They had a lot of time to train. They had a lot of time to toughen up. And the culture of the Republic, the Mid Republic specifically, emphasized to the extreme valor and warfare. Cowardice was not an option for the Romans. And I would encourage you to read Polybius and his sections on Roman culture. I think I'll read some excerpts here too. But valor and bravery in battle is the most important thing of all. And you have Roman historians will create lists of like who was the bravest dudes around. You have it's like who won the most fights, who has the most scars, who has the most battle wounds, who has the craziest military record. And I'd encourage you to check out McCall's book where he, highlights some of these examples. You've got, historians debating like who was literally the bravest Roman ever. Oh, it was this guy who has his hand cut off, and he has a steel, he has a metal hand made for it. He's like missing body parts. He's covered in scars. He's fought, this many single combats. One thing we forget about the Romans, especially the mid-Republican Romans, is we always think they're disciplined, they're ordered. The Romans were actually obsessed with single combats, and it comes up, all the time in their, um, you know, battle reports, not battle reports, but writings. Single combat was an aspect of Roman fighting. You have these twin disciplines of disciplina and virtus. Virtus is courage, bravery, manliness, going after the enemy. Disciplina is like, well, there is also a time to hold back. And the Romans were constantly trying to find the right balance between these two values. And if you look at Roman law courts and trials, between aristocrats, you have aristocrats literally, and Gaius Marius did this too. Gaius Marius, he fought single combats in Spain under Scipio Aemilianus. In the siege of Numantia, you have the Spanish champions come forth and the Roman champions come forth, and they have single combats. It happened all the time. But anyways, in the law courts, Romans would literally strip off their clothes and show their bodies covered in scars, and that was a legal argument. Look, I can't be a criminal because I am a fucking brave son of a bitch who's put my life on the line with the Republic. Would, a thief be covered in these scars? Would a bad person be covered in these scars, given in sacrifice to the Republic? So what you have is a military force with extremely high combat motivation. I'll give you a brief excerpt from Polybius, who was a contemporary during the Third Punic War. He was present at the, destruction of Carthage, and he, really wrote significantly about the Republican Roman military, mid-Republican Roman military. So, he writes how, quoting directly from him, quote, a very excellent plan also adopted for inducing young soldiers to brave danger. When an engagement has taken place and any of them have showed conspicuous gallantry, the consul summons an assembly of the legion, puts forward those whom he considers to have distinguished themselves in any way, and first compliments each of them individually on his gallantry, and mentions any other distinction he may have earned in the course of his life, and then presents him with gifts. To the man who has wounded an enemy, a spear. To the man who has killed one and stripped his armor, a cup. If he be in the infantry, horse trappings, if in the cavalry. Though originally the only present made was a spear. Now, this is the really important part. This does not take place in the event of their having wounded or stripped any of the enemy in a set engagement or the storming of a town, but in skirmishes or other occasions of that sort, in which, without there being any positive necessity for them to expose themselves singly to danger, they have done so voluntarily and deliberately. So highlighting that again, he says the men are rewarded for valor, but not in the context of a set engagement, pitched battle, but in occasions where there wasn't a need for them to expose themselves to danger, but they went out and fought. And, if you're familiar with ancient warfare or even, writings like the Iliad, killing enemies and stripping their armor from them is kind of an integral part to, the whole game of ancient warfare. So you can kind of see the Roman cavalry does not lack for motivation because, basically their whole social standing, depends on it. Um, you know, to quote from, continue mentioning Polybius, Polybius goes on to say, quote, by such incentives, those who stay home are stirred up to a noble rivalry and emulation in confronting danger, no less than those who actually hear and see what takes place. For the recipients of such rewards not only enjoy great glory among their comrades in the army, an immediate reputation at home, but after their return they are marked men in all solemn festivals, for they alone who have been thus distinguished by the consuls for bravery are allowed to wear robes of honor on those occasions, and moreover, they place the spoils they have taken in the most conspicuous places in their houses, as visible tokens and proofs of their valor. No wonder that a people whose rewards and punishments are allotted with such care and received with such feelings should be brilliantly successful in war. So there's more evidence than this discussing the motivations and bravery of the Roman cavalry, but I'm going to spare you that for now. Again, I encourage you to check out other books, books and academic articles, academia. You can find a lot stuff on there. I encourage you to read actual books. I meant this Cavalry of the Roman Republic book. Soldiers and Ghosts by Ted Lendon, J.E. Lendon. Michael J. Taylor on academia. He's a historian. He has some great articles about the ancient Roman army. Ross Cowan, he has a really good book. I can't quite remember what it's called right now, but his book is excellent also. But what I'm saying is these were highly motivated soldiers who, you know, victory in war was everything, especially in these single combats. You got to strip your enemy and display the armor in your house, and it's like keeping up with the Joneses. It's like, oh my God, you know, Marcus down the street, his like house is pimped out with all this captured like Gallic armor. Come on, buddy. Like I got to do better to rise up to his reputation. That was a huge motivator. You know, it's kind of like, I don't know. It's hard to, you know what I'm talking about, okay? That is how you showed you were the man in your society. That's how you showed you were awesome, was by collecting all this armor off your dead enemies. So the Roman Republican cavalry, highly, highly motivated. Um, so, where does this reputation for being bad come from? Why did they fade out? You've probably been saying Triarius, get the fuck on with it. Get to the point. It's been 20 minutes already. Jesus Christ. Okay, so you got a couple things going on. So, first of all, these cavalry are drawn from the noblest classes. And there are really only so many of them. In any society or whatever, you're only going to have, everyone can't be rich, right? So you're with the cavalry class, you're really talking those top tiers of the population. And, at this time in the Republic, it's a levy system. To even be in the army at all, you needed to have, a certain property qualification, even just to be in the poor bloody infantry, because you got to pay for all your own gear. The state isn't supplying it at this time. So you kind of have to prove that you actually have like the financial resources to kit yourself out with, equipment to even fight at all. But, the cavalry class, they're the top tier of society. You only have so many of those people. So, for example, in the Punic Wars, basically the Roman cavalry is just plain and simple outnumbered. It's not a question of quality, it's a question of quantity. There are, numerous other accounts outside the Punic Wars, the Roman cavalry defeating Gallic cavalry all the time in the Mid Republic. Um, defeating Gauls in single combats all the time. And that's not just in these kind of mythical periods, but, well accounted for. Gaius Marcellus, known as the Sword of Rome, he defeats a Gallic champion in single combat and is, Rome's leading general in the Punic Wars before he's killed scouting out the enemy lines because he was a very kind of impetuous general. He was called, the Sword of Rome, and then, the Great Delayer, the Great Cunctator, what's his name? Not Flaminius. That Flaminius was another guy. He was kind of a jerk, and he died in another battle in the Punic Wars. Fabius Maximus, that's what I'm talking about. The Great Delayer. He was called the Shield of Rome, and he was, extremely cautious and never fought Hannibal in an open battle, but tried to kind of just starve him out, sort of thing, tail him, prevent him from foraging. Which again, that was a really great strategy to use against Hannibal, an enemy, far away, reliant on foraging. And the Romans hated him at the time until they got massacred at Cannae. They were like, dude, you're you're a Roman. You got to face this guy in open battle. Where is your Virtus? Enough strategy. Where's your manliness? And I'm not really joking about that. So, they were motivated to fight, but they were limited in number and outnumbered. At Cannae, Hannibal outnumbered them hugely. The Roman cavalry, plain and simple, was just outnumbered. Um, if you look at, again, the battle of the skirmish at the river Ticinus, or Ticinus, however you want to pronounce it, The Roman cavalry engages the Carthaginian cavalry, mainly Gauls and Spaniards. Actually, at Ticinus, I think the cavalry would mainly have all been Spaniards. The Gauls didn't join in at that point. But the heavy cavalry engages, and then Hannibal takes his Numidian cavalry and hits the Roman cavalry in the flank. I mean, look, if any army from any period of history gets flanked, they're gonna lose. That's just kind of the way it goes. So can't really blame the Roman cavalry for that one if they got ambushed and outflanked. Um, at Cannae especially, look, the Roman cavalry is never going to catch the Numidian cavalry because they're light cavalry on the one wing, and then on the other wing, the Carthaginian heavy cavalry. I think the numbers are at least 3-1 numerical advantage for the Carthaginian cavalry. Look, like, if you're outnumbered, you're gonna lose. That's just kind of the way it goes a lot of the time. Not all the time, but if you're equal quality and outnumbered, that's kind of the way it goes. Now, later on in the Second Punic War, at the Battle of Zama, this time the Romans and the Carthaginians have actual, cavalry parity. Um, and, the Romans win the cavalry battle at Zama and put the Carthaginian cavalry to flight. So, it's not quite as clear cut as it seems. And Jeremiah McCall posits there was, a slight, there was a reform of the Roman cavalry during the Second Punic War. There's no direct evidence for this, but that they, started to adopt Greek style armor and equipment during this time period. So now we got to look at other reasons why the Roman cavalry faded out. So you start to see during the Marian reforms, and actually even going back to the Second Punic War, the Second Punic. So I'm going to kind of start over a little bit. During the Second Punic War, that's when you really start to see the recruitment of large number of allied cavalry, specifically Numidians. The Numidians are originally on the Carthaginian side, and then Scipio Africanus actually gets kind of has a bromance with one of the Numidian leaders, Massinissa, and he switches over to the Roman side and brings his Numidian cavalry with him. The Romans are also recruiting heavily Spanish cavalry in Spain, as are the Carthaginians too. So you have large numbers of foreign cavalrymen start to being used in this time period, and a little later, you also will have Gallic cavalry being used by the Romans as well as mercenaries too. But the Roman cavalry is still present in those armies, but they're becoming a minority, and that's just because of pure and simple numbers. There just aren't enough Roman high-class citizens to have like a huge cavalry force the way their army is structured. Because you have to have a property qualification to be in the cavalry. Then what else do you have? So over the course of, the Republic, the Roman military culture changes. After the Punic Wars, Rome is filled with slaves, basically. And, these large slave plantations kind of begin to replace the free farmers. And these free farmers were kind of Rome's manpower supply, their source of manpower. You needed property holding farmers for their military structure to work. And they're just becoming more scarce. You have the Teutons and Cimbri, breaching the Alps, crushing numerous Roman armies, slaughtering them. There is a crisis in Rome. Our soldiers are being massacred by the Teutons and Cimbri. And we, unlike the Punic Wars, when we had all these free farmers, we could raise armies again from the propertied class. We just don't have enough people with property. So we need to start drafting common soldiers into the army, commoners, landless men into the army. And, now we actually have to start training them up, with trainers. Marius uses gladiators to train them because these landless men, they don't have family armor and swords that, the propertied men would have passed down. They don't have their, fathers and grandfathers to teach them how to fight. We have to teach them. The state has to teach them how to fight now. And, the cavalry, there when you have this, you know, what happens with the army is it shifts from being, really a levy of the propertied classes to, the bulk of the army is now made of these landless people. And they're full time now, basically. Levies still do occur all throughout this late republic, but the Marian reforms, you're now kind of seeing these full time armies. That's a very different military culture. Now the upper classes are more, and they still do occasionally provide cavalry, but now they're more only being officers, not really common fighters. As you have these, common fighter, the army's culture has changed, but also the culture of the upper classes has changed. You have this infiltration of Greek culture into, the Roman system. And people like Cato the Elder mock these new Greek ways, but they're infiltrating. Scipio Africanus, this was shocking to other Romans. He was he loved the Greeks. He slept with, the books of Greek authors, specifically Xenophon, Xenophon's Cyropedia, under his pillow. And he did his athletics naked in the Greek style, shocking to the Romans. So, Greek culture takes off, and part of Greek culture is, more interest in civic activities compared to military activities. You know, Roman aristocrats become more interested in the arts. They also become more interested in the law courts. And this is especially, you have this serious transition of how do you win fame and acumen as a, Roman aristocrat. This changes from, purely demonstrating that through military service to also having alternate means of display, display in the law courts. So instead of, becoming cavalrymen, they're more interested in, studying these different things, which will, equally bring them, fame and glory in Rome. That's not fighting, basically. So I'm going to wrap this video on. I've rambled long enough, but the takeaway here is, the cavalry during the Roman Republic was not bad, but it was few in number. And eventually, the aristocrats who provided the cavalry, their culture changed to where they were not necessarily interested in, performing the duties of a cavalryman any longer. Jeremiah McCall also kind of postulates on the effects of the social war, which was fought between Rome and her Italian allies fighting against each other. And there's very little cavalry activity in those wars, and he's kind of wondering if, that might have been a cultural shift to legionary fighting. But all in all, when the Roman cavalry was active, during, the earlier times, it was pretty good. Even look at Pyrrhus's expedition into Italy. You have these suicidally brave cavalrymen who are trying to bring him down, and they successfully fight off his cavalry, excellent Greek cavalry. They kill, they try and kill him. They kill a guy who he has dressed. Pyrrhus even has his bro dress up in his armor to try and take the heat off him, because you have these suicidal Roman cavalrymen, trying to cut him down, and they do, succeed in cutting down his bro. So I'm going to finish you there. And if you like this video, I'm going to be doing more history stuff. I've been slacking off on the channel, I feel like. I got to upgrade my quality too. But I'm planning on bringing more history stuff. If you like this video, subscribe, hit a like. I feel kind of like a sellout, kind of cheesy asking people to subscribe and like. But, I'd appreciate it if you did. Have a great day. This has been Triarius Wargaming. See you guys in the next video.